I want to tell you an idea that I used to make my D&D game much easier to run. When I first started my very first campaign, I didn't have a world. I didn't really want to set it in like the Forgotten Realms or Greyhawk or anything like that, but I also knew there's no way as a brand new DM that I'm going to be able to make up everything from a world. So I started thinking, what could I do to cheat in order to make my life a whole lot easier. And so what I came up with was the idea of using my country, the United States' map, as a layout, and I'm going to put my towns in there, and then I'm going to use that as a cheat because it's got a whole bunch of ecology and it's got a whole bunch of information about each of the towns, and I can kind of pick and choose what I want and get some inspiration. So let me show you. What I very first started off with was this little bitty town that I threw together in like 5 minutes in Photoshop. I know the map looks like a 6-year-old put it together. I was older than that, but I don't want to tell you how old because it's still embarrassing how terrible of an artist I am. But this is all I had. This is where my little character started. We kicked off in here. I knew I wanted it to be snowy and I wanted there to be mountain ranges, and that was about the extent of what I had thought through. I had created all the NPCs and stuff like that, but I'm thinking I want something bigger. So I started thinking about how could I put that in the United States. And so what I did was I drilled down over here and I picked an area when basically kind of north of Seattle is what I picked. As a immediate modification, what I did for my little world is that I said none of this was here. I am really frustrated because my original concept for this world when I ran this campaign, I felt super clever for, and I just watched an awesome Matt Colville video. Shamefully, I just binged watched like all 93 of his running the game episodes. But in one of his videos, he mentioned the exact idea that I had forever ago. So my idea for my campaign, and you don't have to use this just to use your country's map, but my idea was that my setting was a super post-apocalyptic United States, that there was the Third World War, there was all of this radiation fallout, and that's how we wound up with things like magic and orcs and elves and stuff like that. Apparently somebody else published an actual whole novel series about that, but I'm not bitter. Either way, this idea can still work for you. We know our own countries relatively well, and the awesome part about this is that you can then kind of pick and choose where your towns are, and then there is a ton of information out there about those areas. So for example, like I said, I set my little town of Travensburg in the Seattle area, and at some point, the adventurers decided they needed to leave that town. They traveled to a far off place where they needed to get supplies. They needed a much bigger town. So what I did was I just choose this town of Aberdeen down here. I wanted a coastal town. I wanted them to be able to travel through it to deal with some of the mountain issues between here and then the long traveling. Again, I just assumed none of this water was here. That was part of my post-apocalyptic aspect. I just said that's all one big valley with a few pockets of water kind of thing. But what was great about this is I could really easily use the map information to say, okay, well, can they travel from just straight here to here? No. And then I said maybe there's these other little towns along the way. And I gave them the option of, hey, you can either try to make it a straight shot and just plow your own path, but they had like teams of horses, they had all kinds of like wagons and extra people and NPCs that were traveling with them. So they're like, no, we're going to stick to the major roads. Again, that showed them, hey, if you go straight through, it's going to be shorter, but it's more wild territory. It's not as explored. If you take the kind of caravan trade routes, then you're going to know that you've got a path. There's a couple little towns along the way. And what it allowed me to do is, instead of me having to come up on the fly with all these towns and all of these NPCs, it was really simple. When I wanted to think about the coastal town that they were going to go to buy all these supplies, I just Googled the Aberdeen city, and so you can just put in Aberdeen, Washington, and what came up was the entry from Wikipedia about it. And so I just kind of came down through here and ripped off some of these ideas. I just looked through like, okay, what's the geography? What's the climate? What are they dealing with? Like, obviously they're a coastal town, but then I came down here and I looked into the industry. Like, what kind of fish do they fish for? What are the things that are kind of happening in the town? And so this is what's really cool. I mean, one of the main reasons that people use established campaign settings like the Forgotten Realms is that there's all this history behind there. But if you want something that feels much more personal and made up by you and not written by a lot of other people, this is an awesome way to pull that off. I mentioned the climate. That was another great thing. I wanted to have like a weather calculator, and I wanted something that made sense for how that weather worked and what the weather was that day and how the seasons changed over time. And so this was another thing that allowed me to do that. It was super simple. I can just pull up what the weather is on that time. If you wanted to get really detailed, you could go into like the Farmer's Almanac for 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And then that was the last layer of the kind of history that I started to pick out for my world, was that I started looking at the history of these areas. And it gave me all kinds of ideas for what I could do. So, what happened between the Seattle and Aberdeen area 400 years ago in the history of the United States. I could start looking into migratory patterns of different animals like the buffalo and stuff like that are up in this area. What's that like today? What was it like 100, 200, 300, 400 years ago? If you lay your world over top of whatever your country is, the United States, or if you're somewhere else, that's great. If you start off with just that one little town, oh, my town disappeared, that's sad. If you start off with just your one town, well, they're not going to know that you're using this idea for probably a really long time. And so again, if you're kind of making up your map, if you just take the Google Maps, obviously that's going to mess it up a little bit, and they're going to be like, oh wait, this looks just like our city or state or whatever, or country. But if you start off small, which is what I did, I started off with just the town, and then I literally hand drew a terrible, terrible map. I don't even have it scanned in. I did it on a piece of 8.5 by 11 paper, and I just did triangles for the mountains. That's how terrible it is. I'm too ashamed to show it off. But my players never figured this out. We played the game for a couple years. We didn't really expand much beyond this area, but it was great. I got a plethora of information about all the towns around there, and I was able to put that in, give it kind of like an Instagram filter of make this into the fantasy world, and boom, I have a huge wealth of history from several hundred years over the span of what's happened in just this one area. And you'll have that as well. Anywhere in the United States, there's tons of documented history about what happened in that area, what industries there were, even, before industrialization. If you go back to 400 years ago, 500, however long you want to go back to figure out, okay, what was the industry like in this area? There was a river, so it was just stuff going up and down the river. The Native Americans were in this area. How did they survive? What were the things that they hunted? Were they the Native Americans that moved around all the time? Were they the ones that actually lived in homes and stayed still? All of that kind of stuff, that's just the United States. That's just one small area of the United States. If you spread your world out, even if you're from the United States and you want to use, Russia or the frigid ice north, or if you want to go down to the super uninhabitable Australia, where it's like you pretty much, if you go anywhere from the edges and you go into the center of the country, that makes total sense for a D&D world, because everything at the center of that continent is going to kill you. And then there's a ton of history around all of those areas, right? So you can just take that and say, oh, well, this is no longer, President XYZ of the United States. I'm going to say this is whatever, your guy, your king, even a dragon, or whatever you want to put in there. That was the other thing that I really, really liked about this. I wanted to have a better understanding of the area, of my whole area. And what I actually did is I took this United States map, I put it into Photoshop, and I did concentric rings of the different dragons based on, okay, they're able to fly 70 to 80 miles in a day. How big are the areas and how many dragons would fit into this area? And that was just something that got me kind of excited of, oh wow, now I can get a much better picture of across like the whole United States, where would there be dragons and how big of a territory would they have? Are there one or two overlapping areas? And you can do that with any monster. And then obviously there's all kinds of subterranean stuff that you can do as well. So I hope this was helpful for you. Stay tuned. My next video that I'm going to do is about using real world for politics, because there's a huge rich history of that through our whole world. So you can kind of label and steal and pick and choose those different ideas, and that way you don't have to make it all up as you go. So I run a little website called d20.pub, the D20 Pub. Check that out. I'm posting blog posts over there. I don't have a Patreon or anything else like that. I also run a little website that's dedicated and specific to just Tolus, so you can check that out if you want. the most amazing city campaign ever. It's unofficial. Monty Cook and Monty Cook Games built this setting. I built a website to make it a lot easier to navigate because there's so much depth to this setting. But using our same idea, you could take the Tola City and you could stick this on the east coast of the United States. And so this could work for just about any fantasy setting that you can come up with. So let me know in the comments if you've done this before. If you know the name of the series that stole my idea, okay, I didn't know about it, so I didn't steal it. But the one where they actually said it's post-apocalyptic and the radiation is what created the elves and stuff. Put that in the comments because I'm really curious if I can find that without going through all those Matt Coville videos again. Thank you very much, and let me know how your game goes.